Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. My name is Krystal Fox, and I'm a League Membership Director, as well as your host for tonight. Thank you for joining us. As Black History Month ends, we want this episode to focus on all the historic political gains made by Black women. This is an important topic for the League of Women Voters as we prepare to celebrate 100 years in 2020. In order to celebrate the future this organization is about to embark on, we want to think about our history and celebrate the political gains made by Black women. We do this in hopes of encouraging growth in our organization, in our communities, and in our country. I'll speak today about the history of the League with respect to race, and I've invited Terri Crawford, Adjunct Professor of Black Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, to educate us about the many Black women who've made political history. As we think about our country's history, it's important to remember that the stories we learn are told through a specific lens that ignores the disenfranchised. This is no different when we tell the history of the women's suffrage movement, from which the League of Women Voters springs. Today, I hope to add an additional viewpoint to that history. This movement began in 1848 when a group of abolitionist activists, mostly women, but some men, gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the problem of women's rights. They were invited there by the reformers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And for the next 50 years, the women of this movement fought for the right to vote. Women worked tirelessly around the country and even abroad, in order to fight for women's rights. And starting in 1910, some states in the West began to extend the vote to women for the first time in 20 years. Multiple attempts were made to make a national constitutional amendment, but failed, and women had to continue to fight. In 1919, an amendment to provide voting rights for women was passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification in 1920. This victory ushered in a new voting history. And also in 1920, the League of Women Voters was founded, 6 months before the ratification. The League began as a mighty political experiment designed to help the women carry out their new responsibilities as voters. It encouraged them to use their new power to participate in shaping political policy. From the beginning, the League has been an activist grassroots organization focused on creating leaders in nonpartisan politics. The League founders believed that maintaining a nonpartisan stance would protect the fledgling organization from being mired in party politics. However, League members are encouraged to be political themselves by educating citizens about and lobbying for government and social reform legislation. This is a familiar history, and is something to celebrate as a foundation for growth in our country. More people across the country would now be able to exercise their rights as citizens and vote to determine their own future. However, this new future was not available to all women, just as the Women's Suffrage March had not been available to all women. Right from the beginning, the Women's Suffrage March embraced many values of white supremacy and discarded Black women's work in this role. The historic convention at Seneca Falls, for example, invited no Black women and only one Black man, Frederick Douglass, who fought hard to include voting rights as a platform to secure women's rights. The heroes of this movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, used rhetoric of racism time after time when they felt it would move their movement forward. Our first example of this occurred when the 15th Amendment was being ratified in 1870, a provision that could have barred the states from denying Black men the vote. Stanton argued that if Black men had the right to vote before white women, they would become dangerous to white America. This rhetoric was damaging and invoked fear across the country. And it seems intolerable, even more intolerable, that Stanton used this language as she called Frederick Douglass her friend. Frederick Douglass was able to refute these statements by saying, when women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their homes and hung from lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and dashed upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and rage at every turn, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. And while this statement helps bring into focus the plight of Black America at the time, it underscores also the place that Black women found themselves, as they could not separate their race from their gender. These tensions continue to plague the movement. Black women attempted to work with the suffragettes, but were continually denied. In 1896, politically active Black women, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and Frances E. W. Harper, among others, founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. This organization worked to focus on the whole identity of Black women and provide opportunities for the improvement of Black people's lives, which included voter rights. When the League of Women Voters was founded in 1920 by Carrie Cat Chapman, they continued to ignore Black suffrages for political gain, as they considered whether or not to include combating racial discrimination in their platform. Racial arguments continued to prevail, leading the women of the day to ignore the plight of Black women and continue to embrace racism. Often, when we look at history, we make allowances for the prevailing thoughts of the time period. However, even as we move forward in the history of the League of Women Voters has not progressed in combating racial discrimination as the rest of America began to do so. The foundation of the organization continued to have ramifications and on the way the policies were shaped within it for years to come. So today we want to acknowledge this history and celebrate what Black women have done.
Okay. Thank you so much, Krystal. I'm so glad to be here today. My name is Terri Crawford. I am adjunct professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in the Department of Black Studies. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, and I am also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and that's very significant as we talk about this history. I am Political Awareness and Involvement Chair for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated for Omaha Alumni Chapter. You talked about the march and some of the political activism of those that were involved in the abolitionist movement. I think it's significant to mention at this point that Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was the only Black Greek letter organization that was involved in that women's suffrage march. Deltas, as you know, felt that it was important to engage in the process, and as one of the first official acts of community service and social activism, they participated in that march. So I think it's important that we had this conversation today about the historical and political gains of Black women in the political process from then until now, and also in a more contemporary context as it relates to the midterms that we just completed. Shirley Chisholm, as you know, over 50 years ago, was the first Black woman who was elected to Congress. And then in 2018, and with the new junior class that is incoming, Ayanna Pressley, who is the junior congresswoman from Massachusetts, she's actually in the office that would have been Shirley Chisholm's office. So the symbolism, you can't avoid exactly how powerful that symbolism is, that she is housed in that office and will be doing her work on behalf of her constituents from that very office. In addition to Ms. Pressley, we had at least 5 Black women who already joined the 20 in Congress who came in as part of this junior class. So that was really significant that they were young, they were engaged, and they were women of color that are now in our U.S. Congress and also in the House of Representatives. Now in this November midterm election, those 5 women were able to win their seats after they all ran from their perspective. Okay, it's too late to start over. Can we?
Nope.
Okay. So in 2019, that cohort of 5 women joined the already 20 women that also have seats in our Senate and also in the House of Representatives. It has been noted through the NAACP and other organizations through polling that Black women also prevailed on the state level, and not just on that. It's very significant that they prevailed in the House of Representatives and also in the Senate, but also on local levels. National organizations such as Democracy in Color, Color of Change, the Collective PAC, and the Black Voters Fund, to name a few, utilize the leadership skills of African American women in that election cycle. So what happened in that cycle, just as the League of Women Voters did when they created this groundswell of grassroots efforts, the same thing happened in this election cycle. And I think we saw how it paid off for those individuals that were running for those seats. We even had Oprah knocking on doors on behalf of the senator that was in Georgia, who was running, Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams for governor.
We had Michelle Obama, who had the When We All Vote campaign to assure that not only women in communities across the country were engaged in the process, but she also wanted to assure that Black women knew how important this particular election cycle was for those that were engaged in the process as voters and those that were engaged in the process running for elected office. Julia Stanton became the first African-American woman elected to serve as lieutenant governor in Illinois. In addition, Melanie Levslick is the first African-American to be elected to the New Hampshire State Senate. Andrea Stewart Cousins will lead the New York State Senate, and she's the first African-American to do so. So all of those were part of this new election cycle of women who were running, women who run, and women who took it on themselves to make sure that they were engaging in the political process at a higher level. In order to keep up that momentum, the National NAACP, through their project known as Demonstration Project, and also with the Black Pact through the Demonstration Project, they did a post-election poll as to what were some of the most significant issues for African Americans in communities across the United States, and also in those communities where many of these women ran. The poll showed that 40% of Black midterm voters who cast ballots in 2018 did not vote in 2014. We found that significant because a lot of people felt as though there were not issues that affected their daily lives in 2014. However, that changed between 2014 and 2018. In addition, Black voters also accounted for as much as 27% of the Democratic electorate in some states in 2018. Now, as we prepare for the election in 2020, all of these statistics are going to be very important as we continue to have conversations with millennials and others as to the importance of the right to vote, the importance of their participation in the process. It's important to list as part of that demonstration project through the NAACP. They noted that that there had been a 77% increase among African American voters. Now, some of the statistics show that continuously over the last 20 years or so, that there's been a steady incline in voters in most communities across the board. However, during that same period, there's been an incline in African American voters, particularly this particular demographic of African American women. They also said that Black voters surveyed highlighted their top issues to be voting rights at 79%, racism at 70%, dealing with hate crimes across the nation was at about 72%, and government corruption was at about 77%. All groups cited healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, the economy, as very important issues facing Black voters, particularly a demographic that has historically been ignored or historically not been pursued by the candidates. So another one of the questions that we continue to deconstruct in one of the classes that I teach a class this semester called The Black Experience in American Politics. So one of the things we do is to try and deconstruct some of these issues as to how they have a disparate impact on particularly communities of color. So as we were deconstructing some of those and studying some of these statistics, conversations came up as to disenfranchised voters and how that disproportionately affects communities of color. A lot of individuals are not aware of the fact that in Nebraska, you can vote after the 2-year waiting period, although it has been proposed through the legislation, as you know, through Senator Justin Wang, to do away with that 2-year waiting period, so those that have served some time in either prison or have been convicted of some felony at some point after the 2-year period in Nebraska, now they're eligible to vote. But if it passes in our legislation, then that 2-year period will be waived and they will be automatically eligible, which is really important for individuals who have lost that right to vote to be able to engage in the process. Sheila E. Isong, who is part of the National Political Director of the Civic Engagement of the NAACP. So what she says is that cultivating Black women leadership has been instrumental in creating a Black political infrastructure for women that are interested in running and for women that want to be part of campaigning, being involved in organizations such as the League of Women Voters, being active on campuses, being active within communities. She says that voters and elected officials have been historically ignored or erased as part of this demographic. And I think we've seen it some across this city as well. During election time, we saw lots of individuals that kind of show up in the community to have conversations as they're recording your votes because it's election time. Historically, I think across the country, it has been noted that when it's not an election cycle, you don't see those individuals that much. So that was part of the conversation as to how some candidates have a tendency to take the Black vote for granted. People have a tendency to also associate the Black vote, particularly the Black female vote, with Democratic candidates. That is not always the case, as you and I both know. However, it is important to have the conversation to make sure that the issues are being addressed that affect this demographic. Black women went on the bench also is something very close and dear to my heart. Particularly, there was a story during the election cycle as well that 19 women who ran for the bench or were appointed to the bench in Houston, Texas. Out of the 19 that ran, all 19 were appointed to the bench and were able to be seated as judges. That was historic for Texas. In fact, it would be historic for any place that all 19 would have happened at the same time. Wins like these, I think, are very important to create a more diverse judicial branch, and also to address diversity in the political pool, the individuals that are voting, the individuals that are organizing, and also in coalition building. Also, in addition to those 19, there were several other judges during the same cycle in Texas, in Illinois, and in other areas where historically Black women had more numbers than we had ever seen before. Similar things happen in Alabama, in Texas, and right now there may be a runoff in Illinois. Mm-hmm. So there are both Black women. Good news for Illinois, absolutely. So there has been tremendous strides with Black women, in particular 2018 and 2019 as we move towards the 2020 cycle, being involved in the political process. And I think much of it started with the League of Women Voters, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and then also with women like Shirley Chisholm, who helped inspire an entire generation of more women to run for office.
Terri, I learned so many things. So I appreciate you sharing that information. And in kind of full disclosure, I am also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So I appreciate all of those mentions and celebrate our history as well. Mm-hmm. One of the things you talked about, though, was including Black women in our political process. What do you commended the League for doing a good job. What kind of things do you think we should be doing and focusing on to encourage more inclusion of Black women and supporting them if they want to become part of the process, but also members of the League of Women Voters?
Okay. I think one of the things that has been vital in all of these processes, as you talk about the history of the League of Women Voters, the history of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and just the history of grassroots organization in general, was coalition building. It's very important to collaborate with other organizations within the community, other organizations who are like-minded or have interests that are coinciding with the constituency or with the particular demographic they want to collaborate with. We cannot overstate the importance of coalition building. It's very important, particularly to engage with organizations such as the League of Women Voters, who have such a rich history, and where the entire mantra is to protect democracy on a nonpartisan basis. It's very important for women in general to be engaged in that process, but particularly this demographic, since it has been an underrepresentation historically from this demographic, but I think all of those things are changing.
Awesome. And then You also mentioned Sheila, the NAACP Civic Engagement Director. I thought your point there was important because if I were a non-Black person, what would I be doing to help encourage inclusion as well?
Absolutely. So although NAACP historically is thought of as a Black organization, as you know, from its origins in the 1900s, there were several individuals who were not people of color that were involved in the organizing of the organization. So the NAACP and other organizations such as the NAACP are really about being the voice for the people. So if you are the voice for the people, then that means all of the people who have the same interests or like or similar interests. It's always important to reach out to other organizations in order to build that collaboration and to build a voting bloc. I think the more individuals you have in a coalition, the more you have that are part of the interest group, then the stronger voting bloc that you have. And with that voting bloc, you certainly get the attention of those that are seeking office.
Awesome. So thinking about just encouraging people to join all organizations
Sure.
and really become involved that way. If you support the mission of the organization, that's a great way for you to help support inclusion.
Absolutely.
Another thing I wanted to talk about is how important do you think it is that Black women continue to be part of the historical record?
You know, I think it's vital to our history because we are leading the way and we have other generations watching exactly what we do. And the reason why I'm able to be here to have this conversation is because there were countless number of women who paved the way for me to be able to have the platform and to be able to have the conversation. I think it's incumbent upon us as individuals that take up space on the earth to give back accordingly as much as we have received. So I guess morally speaking, through our moral compass, it's necessary for us to continue to give back and mentor and groom other individuals to participate in the process. But not only morally is it important, but I think it's important to the demographic to show individuals just how important voting has been for us historically and how important it's going to continue to be throughout history.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important to think about. That was another question I was thinking is how do we continue to engage younger voters? What do you think is our responsibility there?
We have this conversation a lot in the classroom, and I do have lots of millennials. Some are feel as though that they're very disconnected from some of the issues. So we try to unpack some of those to talk about how those issues that are being addressed in Washington affects your daily lives. It's important to have those conversations, I think, on a regular basis with not just millennials, but just with each other in general as to how your voice matters. And if you don't exercise your right to vote, then it's very difficult to complain about what has happened if you didn't participate in the process. So as long as we continue to talk about engagement, how that has to happen, and different avenues, because it's going to be different for different individuals, and there's a place for everyone at the table.
So really connecting the issues to our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
Really will engage younger voters. That's important too. So again, it's the last day of Black History Month. So we're very excited to include the history of Black women in the League of Women Voters. What kind of things do you think we should continue as we move towards the celebration of the 2020 of the 100 years of the 1920 Amendment? What are some things that you think we should really be focusing on in that commemoration? Okay.
As part of that commemoration, I think one of the things we talked about at one of our recent meetings was that there has been an absent narrative, and you talked about some of it in your introduction as to how that history of Black women and some of the exclusion has not necessarily been discussed. I think it's important to discuss it, acknowledge it, and to help build bridges around those particular dialogues that we didn't have and now that we can have. And I think once you have the opportunity to discuss exactly how that exclusion affected all the organizations, it helps us, number one, not repeat those patterns, and number two, to engage everyone who's interested in protecting democracy.
That's awesome. So I think that's my last question. Yeah. So I think as a Black woman who is a member of the League of Women Voters, it's really important for me to continue to talk about this history, but also to overcome it as we see that a lot of the members are inclusive and do want more people of all races and backgrounds to enjoy the work that we do. And so I always want to bring it up because I'm like, no, it used to be this way, but today we make strides for change. And so it's important that I think we talk about these things so that the League has a reputation for inclusion. And I think that's why I wanted to host this specific topic, because Black women have been doing this political work along with the League and beside the League, and the League continues to support them. So I'm thinking I want to end with a note about what do you think the next steps are for Black women in politics in 2020, but also in the League of Women Voters.
Okay. So I think for Black women in politics, again, it's going to be important, and I can't overstate it enough, coalition building during an election cycle and outside of an election cycle. I think when you continue to make those connections outside of an election cycle, it makes it more
genuine.
Yes, more genuine for individuals rather than just showing up at election time. So coalitions year-round is going to always be important for women of color and all women, I believe, to continue to address issues on a local basis and also on a national basis. For us as Black women, I think it's important, again, to participate in other organizations outside of those that we traditionally would participate in. We all want to protect democracy. We all are interested in protecting everyone's right to vote and to make sure that we are educating individuals regarding exactly what that right looks like in Nebraska. And we can do that through all organizations.
Thank you. That's awesome. I am excited for this upcoming cycle. I believe what you're saying is true. We need to focus on that coalition building, focus on being partners to everyone in our community so that we can build a better country. Should I close? For the League of Women Voters, again, my name is Krystal Fox, and we thank you for joining us. And we remind you to inform yourself about the issues and go vote Omaha.